Hey everyone, thanks for coming. As he said, my name is Kit. I'm a creative director at Capital One, and this is the story of learning how to use animation first in prototyping and then in actual production work. So a long time ago, I used to be a print designer, then web designer, then UI, UX, blah, 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 blah designer, and what I'm doing now is called UX choreography, if that's even a thing. Basically, I'm helping designers move things on screen with grace and, most importantly, purpose. And this talk is kind of about that. Here's my story. I can't code, unlike many of you. And what it means, I can't make my designs come to life. I've actually spent endless hours in conversations with clients and users during user testing, trying to explain how that little button moves or something like that. You'll know how it goes, right? You put a PNG in front of the client and say it's a landing page, and then you flip next, and it's search results, and the client goes like, whoa, wait a second, where is the search? You're like, it's that little magnifying glass icon in the corner. And the client is like, whoa, how do I type? And you're like, Ugh. So yeah, I needed a way to prototype interactions. It was back in the days when there were no beautiful tools that Tajan told us about Principle and Pixate and all of that. So I decided to start animating. A long time ago, I used to just make funny GIFs in ImageReady. So that's where I started, and that's what I wanted to do. And then someone told me, hey, bro, it's 2013, it's all baked in Photoshop now. I'm like, ooh, okay. So I started animating UI frame by frame in Photoshop. And it was every bit as horrible as you can imagine. Well, granted, I discovered timeline mode pretty soon, but still, it didn't help much. So then I figured, okay, it must be about the right tools. Someone recommended me After Effects. I downloaded After Effects, I ran it, and I'm screaming in pain ever since. It is super confusing, even if you know exactly what you're doing. So I went on YouTube, and I started looking for some tutorials, and there were a lot of tutorials telling me how to make a little blue ball bounce around. Well, what does that have to do with my UI? So I figured it's not about tools. It must be about some sort of best practices. So I went on Dribbble, and I added animation tag on Dribbble to my RSS feed. On average, people post 100 to 150 animated GIFs a day. And I was watching them all. So basically, over the course of the last couple of years, I watched around 100,000 GIFs, and I didn't get mad in the process. And you know what? Something really cool happened after doing all of that. I started noticing some patterns in all of those GIFs. I started understanding what kind of problems were designers trying to solve with their animation. And I started collecting things and categorizing them in Dribbble buckets. I must have changed them like 100 times, renaming, stuff, moving stuff around, throwing away stuff that didn't fit anymore. And after all this time, it turned out there weren't any best practices. Not yet. UI animation was and still is a pretty uncharted territory. Lots and lots of opinions about it, lots of speakers, lots of books. Some people say animation must be functional. Then some other people say it's about authentic motion. And then there is a distinct group of people who believes that animation should be invisible. What? And a whole lot of others just don't believe things should move on screen at all unless you're in a movie theater. So I think just like Skywalker on Dagobah, we kind of need to believe in UI animation first, after all of those dark decades of web and stuff like that. So let's talk about the fundamentals of it, kind of the principles of why and when you would want to animate your UI, and how could that enhance user experience and make it better. Also, I'm not going to show you all of those 100,000 GIFs. I only got about 60 in this deck. But fair warning, if you got epilepsy or something like that, please leave the room immediately. I like sci-fi, as you can probably tell. The problem with sci-fi movies is that they all happen in this vast fictional universe that I have no idea about. There's a lot of stuff going on and only 2 hours of screen time to tell me what's going on. That is a big problem. So how do best sci-fi directors deal with this problem? First, they focus on characters instead of the galaxy far, far away. They kind of weave the history and geography and all of that of their fictional universe into the main storyline so that, you know, people wouldn't fall behind. Second, they are making their worlds feel real by describing everything according to laws of physics, by making it follow distinct physical precision and great attention to detail. And finally, they make their movies delightful and memorable by adding some sort of secret sauce, something great that keeps it all together. As designers, we also want to tell great interactive stories on teeny tiny screens. Our characters are UX flows, and our fictional universe is just our UI. And guess what? We don't have 2 hours. We have mere seconds before users are confused and have lost attention. I think we can use all the same principles from cinematography and motion design and kind of define 3 pillars of animation: functional, material, and delightful. Functional would be about seamlessly telling your story and introducing your UX characters to users in a timely fashion. Material would be about making our UI universe feel real. And after we tackled those 2, delightful could help people love our products and come back for more. Everything we do should be done for a reason. If you're going to leave the room right now, please remember this one thing, okay? Do not make stuff for shits and giggles. Find the reason for it. So let's start with the most important one, functional animation. One of the first UI animations I saw in my life was this little cursor blinking in the MS-DOS command prompt. It was friendly, it was inviting, like, go ahead, type something. But it was also functional. If the blinking suddenly stopped, that meant that the system halted and possibly caught fire. Note to myself, no one watches the show. So it took me 20 years to understand the meaning of that little thing. It was crucial, the animation was crucial to suggest interaction as well as conveying the system states. State changes in UI, especially on the web, often involve hard cuts, pretty much all the time. It's just one screen after another. And that makes it pretty difficult to follow at times. In cognitive science, there's a word for it. It's called change blindness. When you kind of put something in front of people and then suddenly change it, it is pretty hard for people to understand what happened at a glance. So this is kind of how it goes. Imagine there's a Han Solo and Guido sitting across each other in a space canteen. And then suddenly there's this little spinner and cut. Next scene, Guido is dead and Han is holding the smoking gun, blaster, whatever. So what happened? Did Han just shoot Guido in cold blood, or did he do something first to provoke it? Well, that's kind of how most of the websites and apps still look like. It's just a bunch of separate screens and pages with little to no transitions in between. So functional animation could help us fill those comprehension gaps. It would allow people to follow our app or website story seamlessly without falling behind, the same way they follow the movie. Our brains are hardwired to detect moving objects, to detect motion. This is a reflex. Magicians use movement to perform sleight of hand, right? So they kind of put something in front of us and kind of hide something in the back. Similarly, we can direct people's attention to what's really important, help them focus on important parts of our UI while quietly disposing things they don't need anymore. A good animation can tell the story much faster than any words or illustrations. The language of animation is universal. You don't need to translate it to French or Russian or Japanese. Well-designed animated transitions can probably onboard users much faster than any of those fancy onboarding flashcards that seem to be so popular lately. Engineers and developers tend to measure experience by page load time and kind of abstract number of taps. The perceived user experience is rather different. Anything we put in front of users takes time to process. It's called cognitive load. And if we create animation, we optimize it really well and put it there, the page might load just a little longer, but in reality, it could really help people understand what's going on much faster. For example, shake animation on incorrect data entry seems to take more time than just instantly displaying an error badge. In reality, users might spend up to a couple of seconds just looking around for that teeny tiny message, while the animated is just instantly noticeable and kind of intuitive for most people. Material animation, the next pillar, is usually misunderstood. Okay, it's not about Google. Not at all. A little bit, maybe. It is about making our UI spatially consistent and predictable by following the laws of physics. When UI animation takes into account things like gravity, perspective, inertia, velocity, blah, 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 it looks authentic, and it kind of helps people memorize our UI because it's familiar and predictable, and they can understand what's going on. But when it doesn't look realistic, when it's just crazy from, things are moving from all places, kind of like most native Apple apps, to be honest with you. If it doesn't look realistic, it could make our apps or websites look cheesy, and people could even distrust our content entirely. We create those fictional worlds, universes within our UI. There are infinite ways to do that. As designers, you all know that. Every UI universe has a unique map. Our off-canvas menus and drawers and floating buttons and carousels, don't use carousels. All of that stuff can be infinitely confusing to people exploring it for the first time. If we treat our UI as a physical object, we make things come from familiar places and kind of go into predictable directions that could really help people find their way around. Remember, people are new to the fictional worlds we create. They're always learning everything from scratch. They haven't seen it in Sketch for weeks or months like you do. And so people need to really understand where things come from and where they can find them again. And this is really what material animation principle is all about. It also means, these day and age, thinking about input, device, and context. Designers love animating this stuff, right? Dribble is full of that. And it might look good on desktop computers, but on touch devices, most likely it will be covered by user's finger and therefore kind of useless. Another problem of UI animation is bad taste. A lot of people, I think, a lot of people don't like UI animation because they saw something really crappy back in the day, and they kind of assumed it's all going to be like that. No, it doesn't have to be, not at all. Our taste is subjective, but it's based on aesthetics, and aesthetics are grounded in the laws of material world around us. It's been like that for, ages and ages. So I think there is a simple trick. If you use laws of physics in your UI as a baseline, chances are you would create something pretty tasteful, to begin with, and it would not go over the top. All right, so let's say our animation works, it drives attention and does all of that great stuff. People get our UI, they can navigate, they try it, we test it, they try it, and they just leave. How can we make them stay? Well, I think this is where the third pillar, delight, could come in really handy. My mom's first computer was a Power Mac. It was 25 years ago. In Ukraine, back then, everyone was using PCs because Macs were crazy expensive. I guess that didn't change much since then. So when I asked her why did she choose such an obviously more expensive option over a PC, she said, because it was smiling at me. That was irrational. But hey, humans are irrational. We're all irrational. We take joy over reason. We kind of choose delightful over boring. I believe it's no longer enough for digital products, for the stuff that we build, to just do stuff. It is not enough. Things we build need to bring fun and be satisfying, because this is our life now. We spend our entire lives immersed in those digital products. But make no mistake, animation and all of our products need to be functional and material above all else. They do need to work, right? So again, please do not use UI animation for shits and giggles, all right? Find UX problem it should solve first. But after the problem is solved, what's left is emotion. We all want to have fun, we want to love our apps and websites, and we want to relate to them. And I think this is where animation can truly shine and help make user experience delightful and memorable. I used to have a physics professor over in Ukrainian Polytechnic Institute, and he hated Star Wars. He was like, lasers don't make sounds in vacuum, or or he said, lightsabers cannot exist. Even if they would never clash like that. And I was like, so what? It's awesome, okay? That's precisely what we love Star Wars for. Cognitive science calls this suspension of disbelief. This is when we make a fictional tale so delightfully engaging that it basically lets us suspend our rational judgment. We love each other, we love our friends and partners and family, kind of despite their flaws, right? And when we love something, we're willing to forgive a couple of glitches, bugs, beta version here and there, and would always come back for more. Bottom line, pure rationality is boring. Take boring movie directors. They kind of shoot their Michael Bay. I'm thinking Michael Bay right now. They shoot their movies kind of by the book, meticulously using all of those best practices from Hollywood. And they do that without adding a little bit of themselves to their work, without giving a soul. Best movie directors, on the other hand, they have very distinct and recognizable style. And I think we can also enchant our UI animation with unique appeal, with a certain brand that people would love and always remember. All right, So we talked about high-level pillars. Now let's get into details. Every sci-fi universe has what's called a canon. It's a set of fundamental laws and principles the world lives by. In the world of animation, a canon was created in 1981 when two Disney animators, Ollie Johnston and Frank Thomas, defined 12 principles of Disney animation in their book, The Illusion of Life. Highly recommended, by the way. So these are Disney's 12 principles. A lot of designers already know about them. Maybe you do too. And a lot of designers tend to kind of cherry pick some of these to use in their work. But I think the original 12 are so great, we can use all of them in UI and UX. Well, you don't have to do all at once, but they're all helpful. So I kind of grouped them and followed the same basic pillars, right? So blue for material, green for functional, and orange for delightful. So let's see how they work individually and kind of in relationship to each other. Solid drawing is the first basic material principle. It's just basically about honoring the rules of 3D space, kind of the depth, height, volume, perspective, all of that stuff. Disney animators made that a rule because they wanted their cartoons to look more real. They wanted people to relate to cartoons more. They wanted to make cartoons more kind of familiar and believable. And guess what? I think that's exactly what we do with apps anyways. And what they used to call solid drawing, nowadays I think we just call material design. Animators and developers nowadays use different techniques depending on how complex is the transition. If you animate simple stuff, it is called pose to pose. And if you need something much more complex, you use what's called straight ahead technique. And when you implement your animation in code, say CSS or Xcode or JavaScript, actually, no, don't use JavaScript for animation. You have different object parameters to mess with. So if you choose just one parameter, take scale or position or opacity. How do I show opacity change? So if you take one parameter, that would be pose to pose. But if you want to create something really cool and complex and unique, you can orchestrate multiple transitions and multiple many different object parameters, and by doing so you kind of employ the straight ahead technique. Squash and stretch is a great principle that describes the rigidity of material objects. One thing that people were really confused about when Google introduced material design was like, hey, what does it mean my UI is now made of paper? What does it mean? Well, imagine that, right? Your UI can be made, you can imagine that your UI is made of any material, paper or metal or plastic or strawberry jam, for all I know. But whatever material you choose is gonna define the way it behaves, the way it responds to human interaction, and the way things move on the screen. So your choice of material can pretty much define your entire motion brand within a product, the way the entire product is going to be perceived. Do you want your app to be kind of sharp and exact and organized and robotic, or do you want it to be fun and humane and kind of, organic and fluid? I'm kind of saying like this is a good thing and this is the bad thing, but no, not really. You choose whatever applies to your product. I made this website for an oil software company, and my client really wanted the website to look and feel more oily. Seriously, that's the word he used. This is like, crap. Okay, so oil is black, right? So I made everything into dark UI theme. No, it wasn't enough. And then I was like, okay, so oil is this kind of viscous, liquid. So I decided to add these viscous liquid transitions, kind of like these jelly, like round things. And that was it. He instantly loved it, and he took this to like TV commercials and all of it. So the choice of the right material not only helped me build, UI and transitions, it helped define the entire brand. And so that's what squash and stretch principle specifically is good for. Similarly, arcs can also help you define the look and feel of your product and your motion brand. Mechanical things like cars and trains, they tend to move along straight trajectories. Organic things like plants and animals and us, we tend to move along arcs, right? And similarly, it's kind of subconscious how people perceive your UI, but if you make things move in your UI, like kind of following straight lines, it will also be very like, it's IBM's thing, right? It's called machines in motion, right? IBM is lately very famous for that. They've got a very distinct and very robotic motion style. But if you need something more soft and humane, you can use arcs, which is pretty hard, by the way, especially on the web. This is one of the apps we built for Capital One branch iPads. And we really heavily used arcs here for many reasons. First of all, we wanted everything to look more kind of organic and humane and more memorable, and kind of really make the experience of using those branch iPads be more delightful. Plus, we had a pretty, as you can see, arcs are actually helpful to zoom in and out, which is really good when you're building a multi-layer material UI and the navigation model is kind of hard. Okay, so the second group of principles is about functional properties. So I know I started with functional before, but when you actually build it, it's better to start with material, kind of get down your material principles and your information architecture first, and then you get to particular flows and you start using functional. Staging is the first principle, and it is about kind of emphasizing the central idea of your animation, making it very exclusive for users. This is about directing one's attention to exactly where you want it to be, say the important piece of content or suggested next steps, suggested interaction, stuff like that. Most of the UIs we build historically, they don't have a strong kind of conceptual anchor. As a result, people might get lost. But you don't have to rebuild your entire UI and just put a gigantic button in the middle and like kill everything else. You can use motion to stage everything and kind of, draw people's attention to what's important. Timing is the most important principle of them all. No matter what you're building, what you're animating, users' perception and comprehension will be always driven by the way you build your animated sequence. So a sweet spot for one individual UI transition is 200 to 300 milliseconds. That's a good number to remember. It's okay if you animate one thing, like that little, hamburger turned into X. But what if you need something more complex? You have a lot of UI elements that need to be orchestrated in a big kind of thing. This is where you need to build hierarchy, and you need to be very deliberate with what you make your primary motion or kind of secondary motion, what you slow in or ease in, what you ease out, and stuff like that. Imagine you're editing an action scene in a movie, say a duel between Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. First of all, define what's the overall tempo of this scene. Is it fast and dynamic and kind of, blockbustery, or is it slow and, thoughtful and kind of dramatic? I guess the former, right? So then you you decide, it's going to be faster than others. Then you start prioritizing the individual motions. So something important like chopping a hand with a lightsaber should probably stay on screen longer, and less important stuff like, I don't know, some light blinking on the background should be shorter and kind of overlap your primary motion. Basically, composing UI animation, just like movie editing, requires a lot of finesse and a lot of practice. This guy probably knows what I'm talking about. The key to timing is cubic Bezier function, also called velocity curve. So standard code libraries like CSS, they offer kind of very basic out-of-the-box things like ease in and ease out. But you can customize those. And it gets really, really, really cool when you start customizing those, you change parameters, and you really trying to find the right rhythm for your animated sequence. Follow through and overlapping are helping with that. They are about kind of orchestrating multiple simultaneous motions. Things around us don't move in perfect kind of order or unison. You know how in Keynote there's like a build order. It always fascinates me. Like, you know, what if I need things to like just, you know, happen simultaneously? You can kind of do that, but not the point. So when you're building UI animation, developers tend to build separate transitions, kind of separate from each other. As designers, we need to tell them what should kind of happen in unison, what should be primary, what should be secondary. So it's very helpful to give your developers this waterfall diagram, kind of what you see in After Effects, for example, if you use that, those little bricks. It is super helpful for developers to see that. Follow through is about making the parts of some big animated object like a card or UI panel follow the motion of their parent, right? Like when I move, my hand follows me. Overlapping makes sure all of that happens simultaneously. So you can see like the little panel scales up, right? And all the elements scale with it. For developers, stuff like that is trivial. They're like, oh, okay, of course, it's a class and it like scales and everything within scales with it. But it's not as trivial for designers and sure as hell not trivial for users, right? So make sure you kind of point that out. Follow through also helps us communicate the hierarchy between UI elements and kind of set priorities. What's more important, what's less. Overlapping makes sure that all of that is seamless and rhythmic. Overall, this kind of big principle, follow through and overlapping, helps you make your UI animation into a blockbuster. But really, if you need it to be, if there's a good, compelling reason for it. Secondary action principle specifically is kind of similar to that, and it is the bread and butter of the sleight of hand, right? This is about defining what should be put in front of the user and what should be hidden. I always ask myself, so what is that I want people to notice, right? And this is where I am. This is where I need to be. What do I need to get out of the way to get there, right? If I think of my UI as a physical object, right? It's kind of like I need to cross the room just filled with junk, right? So I need to move this crate over here. I need to move this panel up, this panel down, get this icon out of the way, and so on, right? So you define the most important stuff. That's your movie star. That's your primary motion, right? And then you kind of overlap that with your secondary motions. Obviously, the rule of thumb is that your secondary motions should never detract attention from your movie star. Ease is the secret sauce to any professional motion design. It's that one thing that helps people pay attention and also helps you make it look real at the same time. Easing, along with the timing and overlapping, helps people build this comprehension hierarchy to your animated sequence. On the material side, easing kind of helps convey the basic laws of inertia, right? Things don't just instantly accelerate and don't stop abruptly in our universe. And when you follow those simple rules of physics, it makes your UI, your entire experience, more relatable to people. In a conversation, people tend to pay more attention to things that are clearly articulated, and they tend to memorize what's being said last. So, same rule applies to UI animation. If you have something important that is coming into the scene, it is a good idea to ease out that, to kind of slow down, make sure it's very clearly articulated, right? And that it comes last, what you want people to pay attention to. And then if you don't need something anymore, it's vice versa. Make sure you get rid of it at the top speed, at the top velocity, so that people, on contrary, would not pay attention to it because you don't need them to. And here's one last bit to remember about ease. There is no such thing as ease at all. I'm only using that word because you've probably seen CSS or other kind of code functions for animation. In reality, ease in, for example, is just one type of cubic Bezier functions. You know, the one that is kind of more sloping in the beginning, more steep towards the end. But that is the cubic Bezier function. If you start tweaking those numbers, and there are a lot of really good tools online, kind of simulators to mess with that, and then later put in your code. So if you start messing with those numbers, the results would be really great and unique every time. Oh, and by the way, if you ever seen the bounce or overshoot effect, something that goes like this, right? So just try making some of those numbers negative and see what happens. Anticipation is another powerful functional principle that can be used both in the beginning and towards the end of your animation. It is helpful to give people a clue of what's about to happen. You can kind of set the scene in advance to prepare user for something important happening. You can change the shape of your objects. You can change the composition and the layout of your screen. One of the really easy ways to create that anticipation is the other kind of ease, is the ease in, right? So you kind of slow down at the beginning of important transition or important sequence, and people would genuinely pay attention to it in anticipation of something happening, right? It's kind of like, and action, that kind of stuff. The other way to use anticipation or feed forward, some authors call it that, is at the end of your animated transition. Animation could provide visual affordance on the next screen to users, and it feels just like conversation, like, hey, check this out, there's an off-canvas menu over there. So yeah, most of those principles, vast majority, are about making things work, right? That's important. But after you took care of that, now it's delight time, so you can have some fun. Exaggeration is my favorite principle of all, and it is also the most dangerous one. It can make your movement really stand out, feel dynamic and fun. It can draw tons of attention to something and make sure people will notice it. But if you over-exaggerate, just like in real life, it can get a little cheesy, over the top. The classic definition of exaggeration by Disney is staying true to reality, but presenting a wilder form. So it's a really good idea to start exaggerating the feedback of your UI controls, right? So the feedback to users' interaction. You can make it respond in a really delightful and memorable way. And whatever you exaggerate, people would naturally memorize and kind of have fun at the same time. But you don't have to stop at just feedback. You can exaggerate anything you want in your app, right? Your apps do not have to look boring unless you want them to be, right? Have fun, just make sure things are still working, they're still functional. Finally, appeal is the last and most arcane of all Disney principles. Glenn Keane, one of the best and most famous Disney animators, defined appeal as the harmony of all elements. I think this is how we can create that coveted motion brand. So let's think about all the apps and websites we use every day. Are they unique? Are there other apps that do just the same stuff, or maybe even better, or maybe have more features? So why do we stick to just those particular ones? Why do we love them? I think great apps can truly surprise and delight us. They can enable us to achieve much bigger goals. And it's not enough to just make a good user experience. Those apps have emotional appeal. People love them. People relate to them. Kind of people, tell stories about those apps. Oh my God, I had such a good time in Snapchat. Appeal principle also means staying true and consistent with the style and emotion your app, your product conveys. Basically, we are all movie directors when we build animation, and appeal is our secret sauce. It is our secret ingredient to build that unique brand, unique style that would make people remember our UI and come back for more. So, yeah, let's wrap it up. These are 3 pillars to take away: functional, material, delightful. Make sure it works. Most importantly, make sure it makes sense and is kind of spatially consistent, and just make sure it's fucking awesome. Thanks. Questions? Yes.
Where in the process do you architect the animations? Is this right from the beginning, let's say, from the wireframe stage, or even beforehand? Or
As early as possible. Just like we discussed here previously, animation using modern tools is actually very low effort, right? So you can prototype it right off the bat. Sometimes building animation with principle is actually faster than doing, napkin black and white sketches, right? So as early as possible, put it in front of people. Sometimes people would hate your entire product and would just love that little animation. Be like, please keep the animation. It literally happened with us. Yes. I still use After Effects because, I'm a masochist, I guess. But I would most sincerely recommend Principle to all of the, fresh starters. Principle is amazing. It has a very low kind of barrier of entry. It is great. For iOS apps, Pixate is amazing. For web stuff, Framer has no rivals, right? And if you're really into animation, start doing After Effects. Someone else?
I have the same question.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Then how do you translate your After Effects into usable code?
That is the best question of them all, and I specifically did not touch on that too much. There is a whole book on that just came out by Val Head, a great animation expert, and it's called, I forgot. It's from Rosenfeld Media. It's something of animation. And that book is specifically on point with translating the animation into code. I'm approaching more from a designer's standpoint, not from the design delivery standpoint. Yes.
If I can just make one comment, it's not really a question. When applying animation, if you're ever going to attempt it for the web, you just have to be really cautious because every machine, every Mac, every PC, every single one is different. And for your animations, when you structure them and you set them up, you're really hoping for the machine that it runs on, and it'll run at 60 frames a second. And that may not necessarily be true on the web. So just be careful with going bananas with your animation on the web. You can have much more predictable results when you're animating on a native device versus the web. And like he said before, JavaScript will totally break your balls on the web, so use CSS instead. So just some words of caution when animating on the web.
Yeah, just animate responsibly, okay? Yes.
I guess on a similar note, what's the sort of pitfall that you see a lot of people falling into when they are working with animations? What's a common mistake that you see?
The common mistake is, to earlier point, is spending too much time, right? So the key to mastering animation prototyping is learning to get something out, something tangible and helpful, quick, right? Do not spend weeks and weeks animating something awesome, right? Just to find out lately that, you know, no one cares. So, thanks.
All right, thanks, Kit.